This session is titled, Pay for What You Want, Not What You Have. And as you can guess, we're going to talk about church finances. Now, before you run away, please stick around. Hi, my name is Greg Simpson, and I am the minister at St. Andrew's United Church in downtown Chatham, Ontario. What a blessing it is to have you joining me for this session as we look at churches, as we look at the future of our churches, as we look internally at some of the things we're struggling with, as we wonder about where our church is headed, where we as people are headed, and as we prayerfully consider what God is calling us into. It is not uncommon for a conversation about finances to be one of the driving forces of vision work in a church. It's really unfortunate, but very often when churches are doing okay financially, it's actually easier to just keep trucking along the way you've been going. If there's no pressure to change, then we're less likely to change. But for several decades now, churches have been struggling. We have shrinking numbers of people in the pews. We have shrinking numbers of people who are donating. There are more and more places within our world who are desperate for help and hope that comes along with donations. And so even the people who have been donating and supporting strongly to the church for many years, their resources are being spread thin because they're helping this and they're helping that. And thank God that they are. Because there are many, many beautiful things that need to be supported in our community. But that leaves the church in a place of wondering, what comes next for us? What if we can't pay the bills to keep the lights on? What if we as a congregation have shrunk to a point where we can't support full-time ministry anymore? Or maybe we were already there and now we're wondering if we need to join forces with another church just to support the part-time minister that we have. These are very legitimate conversations, and they're common, and they're happening all over the country, all over the world. Certainly not just within the United Church. And I mean, I'm speaking from the United Church of Canada's context, but I also know from reading leaders within other denominations, or even speaking with friends of mine who serve churches in different denominations across North America, this is a common problem. And it's a common conversation. And most of the times, it sounds something like, we are losing money. How can we save? Because if we can't keep this building open, or if we can't stay a congregation, then who's going to do the work of the church? This is a legitimate question, and it's something you have to ask. But I want to encourage you, I want to remind you that that isn't the only question to ask. And for those of us who have spent any time reading about this fellow named Jesus, we know that most often when asked a question, his answers turn upside down the way we look at the world. And I'm going to encourage you to turn upside down the way that you look at your church finances. So there are two specific ways that we're going to talk about that today. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we view church finances and even the people we choose to handle church finances for us and their skill sets and why we choose them for that work and how we might need to turn some of that upside down. Not saying we got to kick them out, but we might need to encourage them to view the church money in a slightly different way. And part two, we're going to address this conversation of paying for what you want, not what you have. Then that very clearly is going to call us into the future. It's going to call us into speculating on what we want. What do you want? Who do you want to be as a church? Who are you as a congregation, and where is God leading you? So before we go too deep into that, I'm just planting that seed so you've got that running around in the back of your head as we talk through this session. So there's this one thing about church finances that I can't remember when it hit me But when it did, it was something that really flipped over my understanding of church finances. So a little bit of background. I grew up in the Presbyterian church. My dad was on the session and he was the treasurer for lots of time. I knew lots of the ins and outs about church finances before I really knew anything about them. And I have had relationships with people who were deep into it. I have known lots of it long before I even got into ministry myself. And now that I'm in ministry, I look at it from a very different angle as well, because I am in this awkward space of being called to lead a church at the same time as knowing that my salary is one of the largest single line items when the church does budgeting. Certainly, there aren't many churches who don't see that staffing is one of those largest items. And so it makes sense if we're struggling financially to say, how can we chop down that staffing one a little bit? I know we'll pay the minister less. Maybe we will cut back on some of the hours. These are legitimate steps to handling it, but they're not the only way. Because every time we look at church finances, we look at it in the ways that we are taught to look at finance in general. And sometimes that's upside down. Here's what I mean. You and I, we all follow a certain trajectory in our lives. I'll describe for you mine. I would really like to work for a chunk of time in my life. I would really like to work at a job that I enjoy so that I don't hate going to work, but I am really hoping that I don't have to work until the day I die. I'd like to retire sometime, whatever retirement might look like. And so every time that I have income, I need to make sure that I take a part of it and handle the costs of living and all of those sorts of things. And then hopefully there's a little piece left over that can be set aside and invested for my future so that when I stop working, I can live off of what I've set aside. You do the same. We all do that. And in fact, when we choose people to be treasurers or be on the finance committees of our churches, we naturally and automatically tend to pick people who we see as making healthy choices in their personal finances. It's a natural thing. If they're doing a great job there, why not let them do a great job for us as a church? Except that that model is not at all what a church does. The church is never going to retire. When we're doing the work of saying we need to put aside this much money to make sure we cover our costs, and then we're going to take this and put this aside and invest so that when we stop working, well, the church is never going to stop working. God's church will be around forever. Jesus will be active in your community forever, whether you're there or not, whether your church is actively part of that or not. I know for certain that Jesus' church will continue. And it's very easy for us to settle into a mindset that says we as church need to make sure we set aside something. And we'll use words like, oh, well, we're putting this aside to make sure that once the boiler blows up, we can replace it. I mean, it's not a bad idea, but it's also not the only way to consider funding. Or we say, we know that we're going to have to replace the roof in a while, so we better put some money aside for that. That is a good thing to do, but it's not the only thing to do, because we get stuck in this mentality of we need to save for a rainy day. Well, look around, friends. Is it or is it not raining? Is it not the day that you need to start spending? Whether that's on ministry, whether that's on mission. And what about the buildings that you're supporting? So when I kind of draw this little flow chart or this little bar chart of this much is the money that goes towards the daily cost, how much of that is your building? And is your building part of your ministry? Is your building helping you be disciples or make disciples of the world? Is your building helping you carry God's message to the people? There's a good chance that it's helping a group of you get together on Sundays, but is that all of what you do? Is that all of who you are? There are too many places where I have heard stories of churches who had enough funds to keep trucking along the way they were until maybe the last one of them died and just shut the lights out on the way out. That is no longer a faithful ministry because the church building is eating up so much of those resources. There's one specific situation I know of where a church had the brave movement to say, we know that we can be a congregation and meet in some other place. So we're going to sell this building, which is a beautiful building and we love and we cherish, and it has not all these nostalgic connections, but it is no longer serving us as a congregation, as a people of God. It has become a millstone around our necks, and we're going to sell it. And we're going to be a congregation and we're going to serve our community in a different way. And they took a huge chunk of that money and paid it straight into another church who they knew was already doing work. I've heard stories about money from the sale of one church putting an elevator in another church. So then this church could actually serve community members who needed an elevator to get into the building. What a beautiful and faithful way of looking at every single thing that we have invested and seeing how we can look to see whether today is the rainy day when we need to spend our investment. The buildings that we meet in are some of the investments that the people who have gone before have invested so that we could do church. But is that building now holding you back from being a congregation? These are hard questions, and I will admit to you that I love architecture. I live in southwestern Ontario, and some of the oldest buildings we have around are the churches. And I love that. But some of those buildings are in the way of congregational growth and development. They're in the way of ministry. So look around to some of the other churches around you and see what they are doing. Maybe they are keeping the building by turning it into a way to actually make money. Maybe they're renting out some parts of it to a business or a not-for-profit group. Or maybe they're turning their building into a better way to do ministry that fits today. I mean, it used to be that we had scouts and guides and CGIT and explorers, and we had 3 different church choirs, and we had all these different things that were going on in our church buildings, and they were hubs of the community. Well, many of those groups don't exist anymore. So have you gone to find the groups that you can maybe bolster, that you can give them a very low rent space so that they can actually do ministry in your congregation, in your community, in your area? Maybe that's a way that you can turn on its head the mindset of how you do your finances. So the second piece that I'm talking about is paying for what you want, not what you have. And you can see I was already talking about that in the first segment, because the buildings are very often what we already have. And the staffing is very often what we already have. And this particular very beautiful and very deep historical and nostalgic piece of ministry that we do is something we already have. And yes, we're paying for that, but is that what the future of your congregation is going to be? Who are you becoming? Who are you serving? What is the future of your congregation in your community? And are you paying for what you want? Very often what happens when we look at all of the money coming in, and for lots of churches, there's not quite enough to cover. And so we really, really hope that maybe we'll get some sort of legacy giving to help out a little bit. Legacy giving is another conversation for a different session. We'll get to that another day. But when we look at this piece, very often what we do is we cover all the needs and all the stuff we have to pay for. We've got to keep the lights on. We've got to pay the minister. We've got to do all of these things. And then only with what's left over do we start dreaming. Sometimes we have to take the courageous step of saying, who do we want to be? And how are we going to pay for that? And once we've got that paid for, now what's left to cover this? And does that mean that some of this has to go? In these conversations, I want to remind you that we are a people of resurrection. We believe in the very roots of our faith, in death and resurrection. But we can't have Easter morning without Good Friday. And so many times Jesus spoke of dying to our old selves and living with Him and for His kingdom. That does mean in your vision work, in your financial planning, in your dreaming about who you might be for your future, who your congregation could be 2 or 5 or 10 or 50 years from now, you are going to see some death to leave room for resurrection. You're going to have to let go of some of what you're paying for now so that you can pay for what you want. It's risky. It's dangerous even. And it is beautiful, and it is creative, and it is resurrection. So for this session, I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of homework. One, I'm going to ask you to take a very close look personally for yourself, and then for you as a congregation. And you're going to have to meet with some of your committee members and talk about how you currently view your finances. Do you start by only paying for the things that you've always paid for, or the things you have to pay for? Is that what drives your decision making? And are you saving for a rainy day and hadn't realized that it's already raining? Are you saving in ways you didn't even realize you were saving? Are there investments that you have made, or maybe the people who got you to where you are, the ancestors, the background that grew the foundation that you are growing from? Did they invest in a way that is now time for you to spend? Many churches within the United Church of Canada have sold manses, and it makes sense. Not many ministers anymore need manses. Thankfully, there are a few around for those who do, but that's a way that churches have made a brave step because the way ministry works has changed. But what about buildings? What about church buildings? What about community needs? Has that changed? Is it time for you to shift where your investments are going? Many churches also have investments in financial products. Is it time for you to take a look at those and see if you need to spend? Not just to make sure that the building's still around, especially not if that building isn't serving, but are there ways that you need to invest in your community? Invest in yourselves, invest in your leadership, invest in the volunteers to give them training to grow them into the new group of who are going to lead your community. Do you need to pay for what you want rather than what you have? This is not an easy conversation. It's not going to happen in 1 or 2 times. I invite you each to do some hard, prayerful consideration. Spend time with your own thoughts and decisions and ideas. Spend time as a community discussing. And then dream, wonder, look for the resurrection. Find the little shoots that are growing through the leaves in the underbrush that need you to invest in them. The seeds that have been planted that need nourishment to grow. We all know that Christ can do that work and is calling us into the ministry of the future, whatever that might look like in your community. Thank you so much, friends, for having the courage, the bravery, for following the Spirit as you are led into a brand new way of doing ministry wherever you are. I encourage you, I'm proud of you for taking even the step of sitting through this video and thinking and wondering about what that might look like for you and your congregation. I love you all. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.